everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're really diving into the deep end with a thinker who, well, he really took on those big questions.
You're talking about Alfred Whitehead?
That's the one. We're tackling his magnum opus, as they say, process and reality. Now, fair warning, this book, it's known for being a bit of a challenge, even for the philosophy buffs out there.
Oh, yeah. It's dense. But that's what we're here for, right? To unpack it all.
Exactly. We're going to break it down and hopefully walk away with, some serious aha moments along the way. Maybe even shift how we see the world a little, or a lot. What makes Whitehead so fascinating to me is, well, he wasn't just a philosopher, you see. This guy was a mathematician, too.
And you can really see that in how he approaches these big questions, right? Because he was working with a different set of tools, a different way of thinking about reality than your average philosopher.
Exactly. Like he had this whole other dimension to his thinking. And one of the things that really struck me was this idea that Whitehead, he didn't believe in a world of static things.
Right? Not just things sitting there unchanging.
Yeah. Instead, he saw everything as a process, like a constant flow of becoming.
That even something as simple as, say, this coffee mug
Is actually a whirlwind of activity at its most fundamental level. Wild, right?
Totally. And that's where one of his key terms comes in, the actual entity.
Okay, so not just any entity, an actual entity. What's the difference?
Well, for Whitehead, an actual entity, it's not some fixed thing. It's more like this burst of becoming, this moment of experience that's always changing and evolving. It's dynamic.
Okay, so everything's in motion. But these actual entities, they don't just exist in isolation, do they? I mean, the universe isn't just a bunch of separate things whizzing around.
You got it. They interact. They're constantly in contact, sharing experiences with each other through what Whitehead called prehension.
Prehension, huh? So that's how they connect, how they share what their experience is.
Exactly. It's like, imagine the universe is having this giant conversation.
Ooh, okay. I like that.
And every atom, every being, everything's chiming in.
That's amazing. So it's all interconnected.
Exactly. And all these conversations, this incredible web of prehensions, it forms what Whitehead called a nexus. And that's what creates the patterns, the structures that we perceive as the world around us.
So instead of looking at, the individual trees in a forest, Whitehead wants us to see the whole ecosystem.
Yeah. The interconnectedness, the relationships, that's the true reality for him.
That's really powerful. It makes me think about how often we get caught up in the separate parts instead of seeing the bigger picture.
You get the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And that's what Whitehead was pushing against. He was challenging that traditional view that focused on isolated objects. He even had a bit of sense of humor about it, actually.
Oh, I love that. Tell me more.
In Process and Reality, he actually refers to some of these old philosophical ideas, and I'm paraphrasing here, but get ready. He calls them ghosts of old faculties, banished from psychology,
Yeah.
but still haunting metaphysics.
He had such a way with words.
Right. He can be pretty sassy. But the point is, he wanted to ground philosophy in something more real, more concrete.
More about lived experience rather than just these abstract concepts.
You got it. And one of the best examples of this, of him really challenging our assumptions, is how he talks about something we all think we understand, a simple stone.
A stone? Okay, yeah. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Right. But in Process and Reality, Whitehead uses that example to really illustrate his point, because we tend to think of a stone as, well, a solid, unchanging object.
It's an image we all have, solid, unchanging.
Right. But Whitehead, he comes along and says, nope, even a stone is buzzing with activity at the molecular level. It's a process, not a static thing.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about it, right? Even the things that seem most still, most unchanging, they're in constant flux.
Everything is.
So what does that mean for us? What's the takeaway for our everyday lives if even a stone is this dynamic process?
Well, I think it means that even the most ordinary things are way more complex and dynamic than we realize.
Yeah.
Reality is a process, always changing, always interconnected. And that's not just some abstract idea either. It has real implications for how we understand ourselves, our relationships, even the choices we make every day. Because if everything's connected,
Then every action, no matter how small, can ripple outward and affect the whole.
because everything's connected, and this is a big part of Whitehead, it all plays into this idea of givenness.
Okay, givenness. Sounds simple enough, right? But something tells me with Whitehead, it's probably not that simple. So give it to me. What's he really getting at with this idea of givenness?
So he's talking about those really basic, fundamental elements of reality, the stuff we encounter directly, the stuff that's just there when we experience the world.
Okay, like what kind of stuff? Give me an example.
Okay, so say you're walking down a busy street,
Right.
right? Are sights, sounds, smells, all this stuff hitting you at once.
Sensory overload.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But you don't actually experience it all at once. Your senses, your memories, even your goals in that moment, they act like a filter.
So we're not just passively taking in whatever's out there.
Not at all. And that selection process, that's a big part of what Whitehead means by givenness. What actually gets through to our experience.
Okay, that's really interesting. So it's like we're active participants in creating our own experience of the world.
You got it. And Whitehead connects this with his ontological principle, the idea that everything in the actual world, it has to be linked to some actual entity, that burst of becoming.
So those decisions about what we experience, what's given to us, they're not random. They're tied into this web of actual entities and they're becoming.
Right. And those prehensions of the given, they're how actual entities create the tapestry of reality by weaving their experiences together.
It's a beautiful image, but it also makes me think, if our experience is so fluid, so dependent on prehensions and all that, what about those concepts we usually think of as more, well, solid, like substance and quality?
Yeah.
How did those fit in with Whitehead's whole philosophy of process?
That's a great question. And actually, Whitehead saw those traditional ideas as kind of, well, stumbling blocks. He felt like they were often used in ways that were just too static, too disconnected from how dynamic reality actually is.
So he wasn't saying substance and quality don't exist, more like he was giving them a process-oriented makeover.
Exactly. He wanted to understand them in terms of this constant becoming. Like take a chair, for example. Instead of seeing it as this fixed substance with a fixed quality of brown, he'd say, that brownness, that's coming from the interaction between the chair, the light hitting it, and our own visual prehension of it.
Wow, okay, so it's all relative.
In a way, yeah, it's a dynamic relationship, not just a set-in-stone attribute.
So the chair isn't inherently brown. It's brown in relation to everything else, like those optical illusions where the same image can look totally different depending on your perspective.
Precisely. And that's how Whitehead understood quality. It's an expression of how an entity experiences and responds to what's around it through prehensions.
It's about the relationship, not just a fixed property.
Yeah.
Man, this is really making me question everything I thought I knew about how the world works. It's kind of exciting, though, too.
Right. It's like he's giving us new eyes to see the world.
Totally. So if we're seeing the interconnectedness of everything with our new eyes, where do space and time fit into all of this?
Ah, well, Whitehead even challenges how we think about space and time. He didn't see them as those fixed, absolute things that contain events. He saw them as relational, too.
Relational. How so?
He believed they emerged from the interactions of those actual entities, always in process.
Hold on. So space and time aren't just the stage where the universe happens. They're part of the play.
You got it. He talked about this extensive continuum, a sort of primordial potential for extension. But it's the actual entities that give it concrete form. They divide it up and create the specific spatial and temporal relationships we observe.
So the very fabric of space and time is woven by these bursts of becoming, these prehensions between actual entities.
That's it. And this has some pretty mind-blowing implications for how we think about causality and change and the relationship between past, present, and future. It all gets very interesting.
Okay, you're really making me work to keep up, but I'm with you. So if time isn't a straight line, like we tend to think of it, how did Whitehead see it?
Well, remember how we talked about time being a multiplicity of durations, not just one single straightforward line?
Right, the idea that we exist in multiple durations simultaneously, that one still blows my mind.
Right. Well, Whitehead saw those durations as coming from the interconnectedness of actual entities. Each actual entity, it has its own unique duration, its own sort of time signature. But they're not isolated. They intersect and overlap, creating this sort of temporal tapestry.
It's like our experience of time is this amazing symphony with all these different rhythms and tempos all coming together. But if everything is constantly in flux, how can we find any kind of lasting meaning? Does anything endure in Whitehead's universe? I'm still trying to wrap my head around time as a symphony of durations, but it makes me wonder, if everything's in constant flux, how do we make sense of things lasting, of things having value over time? How does anything endure in Whitehead's universe?
This is where things get really interesting. That's where he brings in the idea of eternal objects.
Mm-hmm.
But before you start picturing some heavenly realm with like perfect forms floating around.
Which is kind of where my mind went, not gonna lie.
Right. But Whitehead's eternal objects, They're not separate from the process, not at all. Think of them more like, musical notes.
Musical notes. Okay.
So a single note like a C sharp, right?
Mm.
It has a certain quality, a potential to create a sound, but you can play that note on a piano, a guitar, even sing it, and each time it's the same note, but it's expressed in a unique way.
I'm starting to see what you mean. So eternal objects are like the potential, the ingredients that these actual entities use in their, what did we call it? Their becoming.
Exactly. They provide that potential, those building blocks. They're the colors on an artist's palette, the flavors a chef combines, the ideas a writer plays with.
They give shape to the process.
Right. They're not concrete things in themselves, but they provide that possibility for concrete things to, well, to become. Whitehead used this word ingression to describe how eternal objects participate in that becoming.
Ingression. Okay, so like an eternal object of, say, courage that could ingress into a single act of bravery, a lifetime of standing up for what's right, even a whole social movement.
Exactly. And that same eternal object, that courage, it can be part of countless experiences, giving them a shared quality or meaning, even across time.
That's how something can endure then. Even if everything is in process, those eternal objects, they provide a kind of thread.
A thread that connects it all. And that's how Whitehead bridges this gap between what's particular, those unique experiences, and what's universal, those shared possibilities.
Oh, that's something to sit with, for
Yeah.
sure. But these eternal objects, they're not just about physical stuff or abstract concepts, are they? There's this whole other layer to it, right? This idea of values.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets really profound. Whitehead believed these eternal objects, they also provide those possibilities for striving towards greater intensity of experience.
It's like they're drawing us towards certain ways of being.
Yeah, like beacons, guiding us towards ideals that resonate deep within us.
Okay, so an eternal object of, like, love that could be the driving force behind all sorts of things. Acts of kindness, artistic creations, even scientific discoveries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not just sitting there. These eternal objects, they're dynamic forces, shaping the becoming of actual entities, pulling us towards greater creativity, greater connection, greater beauty, you name it.
And that's what drives the universe forward.
That's what Whitehead believed, that this pursuit of value, this striving for greater meaning, it's not just some human thing. It's essential to the creative advance of the universe itself.
So the universe isn't random. It's like it has a direction, a purpose even. But where does that desire for something more come from in the first place?
That's where Whitehead brings in his concept of God. And it's not the traditional view, not at all.
Right, not the man in the sky kind of God. More like, what did we call it before? The cosmic DJ.
Exactly. The one who provides the music but doesn't dictate the dance moves.
I love that analogy. So how does this DJ God fit into everything?
Whitehead believed that God, in a sense, prehends all those eternal objects,
Yeah.
all those possibilities, all that potential.
God is the ultimate appreciator of possibility. That's a beautiful thought.
And that primordial valuation, that appreciation of what could be, it provides a kind of compass, not about dictating specific outcomes, but about offering inspiration, direction for the becoming of actual entities.
This has been an amazing deep dive. I feel like my brain is doing backflips trying to keep up with Whitehead.
He'll do that to you.
But it's also so inspiring. It's like he's giving us permission to embrace the mystery of it all.
Absolutely.
Well, we're about out of time for this deep dive, but I think we've all got plenty to chew on for the next little while, maybe even a lifetime. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, listeners. What eternal objects are calling to you? What possibilities are you drawn toward? What will you create? Until next time, keep those big questions coming.